Thank you. I want to say thank you to Gertie and to the consortium and to all of you for welcoming making this possible today. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you about a teaching project that I'm pulling together, we're in the final stages of, called History in Practice. And what History in Practice is a set of post-secondary teaching materials that are meant to be used and to use history not to educate historians, but to educate people who will be going out to work in the field of mental health. So we're using the internet to create a unique set of classroom materials. And as you will learn through my talk today, we've used a process of intensive community consultation to create these. So today, I'm aware of the passage of time and I have a lot to share with you. So I'm going to begin very briefly by sketching out the larger umbrella that we're working with in terms of the History of Madness in Canada website and also the research on deinstitutionalization that Gertie referred to. But I want to spend the bulk of my time today talking about the History in Practice project, or HIP, as we now call it. I want to tell you about the process by which we created the materials. I want to show you a few of the pieces we've created. And I want to end by sharing some reflections from our community partners on the project. And I'm going to touch base a couple of times with questions for you, but I'm going to have to be very mindful of the time because all this technical stuff takes time to do. So as I said, the teaching project that we're looking at today is an offspring of the History of Madness in Canada website. And this is an extensive website project that includes research, archives, and education. So education is one of the focus areas of the History of Madness project. And this slide just gives you a very quick overview of the development. We started in 2000. We created the original website. In 2007, as Gertie talked about, we got research funding to do a long-term project on the history of deinstitutionalization. So we have used that, the material gathered from that, to create a series of educational websites. The first two are secondary school websites, and History in Practice is our first post-secondary. Okay. So I realize I'm moving through this fairly quickly. If you have questions at the end for clarification, I'm so happy to answer them. So after the asylum project, as I said, it started in 2007, and it pulled together scholars from a variety of disciplines from across Canada. So we have historians, sociologists, geographers, and more engaged in the project. We were fortunate to get a 5-year grant to excavate the very complex and sometimes complicated history of psychiatric deinstitutionalization. So looking at the period from the 1950s, when deinstitutionalization was just starting in some parts of Canada, up to the present day, exploring the relocation of mental health care from residential care facilities to a whole complicated series of community mental health settings. So the first participants in the After the Asylum project were academics like Gertie and myself, and I was delighted with the broad range of disciplines that were represented. But a very positive and indeed very exciting development of the project over time has been the inclusion of people from the community. So we now have, as partners on the project, community organizations, people who are activists in mental health, and people who use mental health services. So that's very much informed this teaching project. And what's really exciting is that I'm just in the process of curating a large research exhibit called After the Asylum that will bring snapshots from each of these research projects that are under the After the Asylum umbrella and make them available through the History of Madness website to a broad audience. So the next few slides give you a sense of the rich set of materials that we have for the After the Asylum project and that we're using for the teaching site. So this is, I thought you would, given the group here today, that you would appreciate a little insight into this project that Chris Dooley has pulled together. Chris Dooley is a health historian based in Winnipeg, and he had spent several years interviewing mental health practitioners, primarily psychiatric nurses who worked in residential care facilities in the big asylums and then had to reorientate their practice to community mental health. And I'm quoting from Chris. Employing my training as a historian, I aim to give voice to practitioners who were themselves deinstitutionalized, whose careers began in the 1950s and 60s at large inpatient facilities, and who later worked in community roles. So visitors to the website will be able to access excerpts from these oral histories that he collected, and it's a very evocative exhibit. We also have historical sociologist Kathy Kendall exploring the first extensive community mental health education project, which took place in Saskatchewan at a place called Indian Head. We've used some of her material for the teaching resources. And medical historian Erica Dick, who Gertie mentioned in my introduction, has done a really sensitive exhibit about a woman called Doreen Beffus. Doreen grew up in a series of institutions. She was institutionalized as a young girl. And she spent a lot of time at the Michener Center in Alberta, which was then called the Provincial Training School for Mental Defectives. So she was there in the 40s and 50s, and while she was a teenager there, she was sterilized without her knowledge and her consent. So Doreen was at the Michener in the 1960s. She was part of that wave of depopulization of mental hospitals. So out in the community. So Erica's piece is lovely because it uses Doreen's writing and particularly her diaries to trace her adaptation to community living and her emergence as an advocate for fellow patients and patients' rights. And she traces how Doreen began to question the right of the state to decide a woman's capacity to be a good mother. Okay, so I don't really have time to talk about the other teaching sites, but that's one of them. And this is the More for the Mind, which is a more history-based. So these are both for secondary school, because what I really want to talk about today is the History in Practice project, because we learned so much from doing the first two sites that I'm very excited to be here and telling you about this site. So as I said, we're creating these teaching resources, and we want them to be used in post-secondary educational places where people are being trained to go out and work as practitioners in mental health fields. So that means we are interested in nursing education, but we're also interested in policing, right? So any place where somebody is being trained to go out and work in mental health, we want them to use these resources. So we've tried to make them very, very flexible. So just to tell you a few things about the resources, we want to give people working in the mental health field a conceptual basket for the history of their field that they're working in, so that they can understand how the work that they do has evolved over time. And to see that the social and professional direction of mental health care is not just an accident, that history isn't just an accident, but that there are ideas and power relationships and processes that create history. And I met with our research assistant on the project on Saturday and I asked her, what do you want me to tell this group at UBC? And she said, I want you to tell them that one of the reasons we present history in the site is because so people can understand that the future is not scripted out for us. We can create a different kind of future in mental health care. I also see that history is useful as a pedagogical tool because history is all about perspective taking. That we look, historians typically will look at an issue or a problem from multiple perspectives. And I think that that's a useful tool for working in the field of mental health. Historians wouldn't use this word, but I think that it's really about intersectionality that we're talking about there. So we understood when we started to develop these resources that we needed to have a product that would sell. So we did extensive, we went out and talked to instructors at George Brown College in Toronto, at Douglas College here, and at the University of Victoria, and asked them, you know, what do you guys need? How long do things need to be? Like, how much time have you got to present things? We wanted to create a product, teaching product, that was engaging and useful. And the other thing that we knew at the outset was that we wanted to bring into the project people who used mental health services. And we wanted them to be our colleagues on the project. We didn't want to just consult them and then go away and produce something. We wanted to take them along through the process with us. So we located a group of community participants here in Vancouver a few years ago, and they're diverse and not diverse. They range in age from their 20s to their 70s. They're all white, and they're all people who've had a significant engagement with mental health services over their lives. Hence the term, as we call them, community experts, which I kind of stole from Gertie. And I wanted this to be the case too. They have a large range of attitudes and politics about mental health services. So they're not of the same mind in terms of what they think about mental health services. So just to speak to this slide for a minute, we wanted to give our community colleagues authority, and we wanted to give them a true voice in the project. And as you will see, that voice has changed during the project. But we didn't really have a clear agenda. And as you'll see from this slide, they knew that right away, that we didn't really know what we were doing. We knew we had this historical material. We knew we wanted to create these teaching resources, but we really didn't know how we wanted to get from A to B. And I actually think that that was a good idea because we didn't have the process all mapped out, and that leveled out the power dynamic in the group. They felt that we needed them to figure out a map of the project, which is the best excuse I've ever heard of for disorganization, frankly. So our community experts, as you can see from this excerpt from Lori, they really responded very positively to our approach. Their feedback on the project has been that it's been a very empowering process for them, that they really did feel like they had a voice in the project. So how did we do this? Well, first of all, we asked them a pretty straightforward question. We said to the group, what do you think mental health professionals should learn? You know, if you were teaching them, what would you teach them? And they had no problem coming up with a shopping list, pretty extensive, as you can see. So we did brainstorming sessions, and these are the themes that came out. This slide represents the main themes and the clusters of themes that we developed. So they had, you know, structural determinants, encompass kind of attitudes towards people with mental health difficulties, and then all the sort of mechanisms of living with mental health difficulties. Resistance encompassed the community, everything from attending a mood disorders association meeting, support group, to more active, kind of more an activist position. And then they talked a lot about emotions and the need for mental health practitioners to meet them in an emotional space. And then medicalization encompassed both the negatives that they talked about in terms of mental health care, but also the possibilities, their dreams for a better system. So then what the historians on the project did was begin to look at the historical research that we had from the After the Asylum project and align it with the community themes map. So I want to say at this point that we as historians on the project, we acknowledged our own expertise, that we knew what was important historically and we wanted it represented on the project, but we didn't, but we wanted to make important history useful, and we acknowledged the expertise of our community experts as well, right? So there were different kinds of expertise, and one wasn't prioritized over the other. So as you can see from this, we subdivided the structural determinants into two different teaching clusters, and the same with the medicalization, that eventually we found we wanted a separate section for models of practice, models of best practice. And what I'm going to do in the next part of my presentation is focus on those two. But first of all, I want to tell you about an unexpected development in the project. So you will remember that I said we set out to consult with our community experts about what they wanted professionals to learn. But somewhere along the way, somebody got this idea that they would actually contribute pieces to the teaching site. That we would harness their artistic capabilities of the community experts to and put them up on the website along with the historical materials. So perhaps it had to do with the fact that Lori brought her puppet and did a little puppet show for us at our first meeting. Or perhaps it was because our team member David Revel suggested that we make art part of the project. But once we started looking at art and I started to read up on using art as a teaching tool, I learned that arts-based inquiry has a very valid role in pedagogy, that arts-based teaching tools can help people think outside of boxes, and indeed that arts-informed inquiry is often celebrated as having real potential for fostering social change. So I'll be sharing a couple of our community art pieces with you today. So I want to do a little bit of show and tell from two of our teaching modules, but I just wondered if any of you at this point, and I'm quite happy to write down responses, have anything you wanted to share about the utility of history in teaching, or the way in which we involved our community experts, or in fact our lack of a clear plan. Those are things I thought that you might have comments that you wanted to make at this point in my presentation, knowing that you're being taped. Bernie has something to say.
I just think, I think this is an excellent approach. I must admit, I used to teach music specialist certification for years, and one of the ways I used to engage students in that was by looking at the history of dialysis and showing them particularly where we come from with old orange cans, things that were sort of built up and put together, and to where we were, but particularly showing them that the state of the art today is not just something that's arrived, it's got a historical background and there's cultural and political elements to how it's
Yes.
developed. So I found it very interesting. So I can see the value of it certainly in my teaching, even though it's a different field.
Right.
Who else? What are your thoughts when you hear all this? That's what you want to know, right?
Well, I'm just curious, and we can talk about the, yes.
I was just going to add, I'm Elsie from faculty at School of Nursing here. I think the utility of history is really important, particularly when you teach in courses that can be potentially be emotionally charged or contentious issues that are discussed and put on the table. It helps students understand the evolution of a particular piece of content and the positioning of that content given the position of society or power or whatever it may be that we may be discussing. So I think history is very important, and the evolution of a particular content area is also key, and the evolution of society as a whole, whether it's in nursing or whether as recipients of healthcare.
Yeah. Well, it's easy for me to say that I think history is important, but it's actually been quite an evolution for me to have to think through, okay, so why is history important? Why is it useful? I think it's useful in itself, for the reasons that you said, but I also think it's useful as a way of learning to look at an issue from multiple perspectives. Okay, so now I want to do a little bit of show and tell. And I'm going to pull some materials from our 2 teaching modules. The first of these is the Medicine and Power module, because this was clearly really important to our community experts. All of them described oppressive experiences that they had undergone in accessing mental health treatment. They talked about professional authoritarianism, the lack of holistic forms of treatment, and a lack of respectful communication. And then they had these dreams, right, of better things. So we developed 2 modules to reflect these perspectives. In a minute, I'm going to talk about the models of practice, but this is about medicine and power and the dominance of the medical model. Okay, so I'm going to now show you Laurie's puppet show, and then a sculpture that 2 other, so here, this is where you just hope that everything's going to work. that's when we were quite stunned by the artistic contributions. They were amazing. And this is another one of the artistic contributions, and I think if I do that, it might even move. So this is a sculpture that was created by Dana and Alistair, two of our community experts. And you can't see it as well as I think you should, but it was modeled on Alistair's actual face. And there's a funnel which is full of pharmaceuticals going right into the head. And then there's not only this rat cage that they put it in, but there's a piece of plexiglass here. So I'm going to read to you a section of their artist's statement. And they called the piece The Psychiatric Gaze. The psychiatric gaze idea developed over years as we noticed a consistent pattern in our interactions with mental health professionals, a feeling that there was a glass wall separating our side of the desk from the clinician. While they could see and hear us, somehow they remained detached. They weren't listening to us. We were not present for them in any real way. The possibility that we were individuals with intelligence and sensitivity on all the things we like to think are mostly human traits, the fact that we might be equals is absolutely out of the question. So this is a harder hitting piece, but I think potentially a really useful teaching tool. So those are sorry, why have I got, anyways. So those were the artists' contributions from our community experts. And this is the historical piece. So we decided to pull some of the Doreen Beffis material in as the basis for a section, a module about the history of sterilization. And as many of you will know, the sterilization of mental health patients and persons with disabilities took place in Canada in the early 20th century, and there was a law in BC and Alberta, but it did take place elsewhere as well. And sterilization is a very powerful illustration of the dangers of unfettered professional power. So, as I told you earlier when I was talking about the Doreen Beffis material, she was sterilized without her knowledge or her consent as a teenager. And after she left the institution, she was, of course, drawn into events that happened in Alberta. So this is an excerpt on the screen before you of a letter that Doreen wrote to a lawyer in 1993 who was representing another woman who was taking the provincial government to court for being sterilized. And students will be able to access Doreen's letter and other materials about sterilization. But we interviewed medical historian Erica Dick, and recorded her reflections about Doreen's perspective on sterilization, which was not what we would think of as a typical response. Okay, so I'm just going to play that for you.
In some ways, this letter is sort of typical of the way that Doreen approaches these things. She ultimately is a very tolerant and accepting person. She says in the letter that she understands that because of her IQ, she was sterilized, and that the government was trying to reduce the number of individuals who were, and she says, mentally handicapped or deformed. She also encourages the client, and this is some unnamed person that Sandra Anderson is presumably talking about, to learn to accept their fate. And that seems to be part of Doreen's resolve for many questions, that she accepts who she is, and rather than feel embarrassed or shy, she turns that on its head and begins to embrace her differences and embraces her abilities as opposed to her disabilities. And even by looking at things that other people have labeled as disabled and turn that into an ability. She seems to take the same approach here with the letter. she talks about one of the ways, one of the strategies that she used to come to terms with her own infertility and the realization that she had been sterilized without her consent, I should add, was that she did a lot of babysitting when she left the institution. In Doreen's diary, when she talks about taking care of children, it does trigger some rather painful emotional memories. The lack of a loving family in her own life, which as an adult she tries to reconnect with her family and she searches for her family, and it's not necessarily a cheerful reunion. Some of her siblings and extended family are rather reluctant to develop a relationship with her. Some didn't know that she was even alive, including her twin sister. And this is very painful for Doreen because her family was essentially the other kids at the institution. So for someone who allegedly had an IQ that wasn't going to permit her to read or write or to understand, this is a pretty sophisticated set of insights. And she reflects on it for herself and somehow comes to terms with her own infertility and seeks a set of relationships with people through these babysitting relationships and through the contacts that she makes in the community. So it really demonstrates, I think, it's a real testimony to her character that she comes to terms and comes to accept her own situation. Ultimately, then she encourages this client who's seeking retribution for sterilization to do the same and to come to accept their fate. And as we know from the court cases that came out afterwards, that wasn't so easy for everybody.
So I now just want to present a couple of pieces from the models of practice, which I think of as models of best practice. And we had one member of our community team, Alex Vercade, who was involved in Unity Housing, an organization here in Vancouver. And Alex made a video with the help of some of his colleagues at Unity Housing and a film student from here at UBC. They made a video, and I'm going to, looking at the time, and how many of you just need to leave at 1 o'clock? Okay, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to show you part of the YouTube video. Okay, because it's 10 minutes long, which is going to be too long for... Okay.
I have about a grade 9 education. I have learning disabilities. On top of that, I am manic depressive. I want to get people out of poverty. I want to be able to get people to function. Odds are against me, but really that's, honest to God, really what I want to do. Years and years ago, I was here without family. I didn't have many friends. I would walk around Vancouver and I would look at the houses and I would wonder what it was like to live in these houses. I had been working in different mental health organizations. In 1991, I received the grant to start Unity Housing, an organization for the hard to house. Unlike most mental health boarding houses, we do not have regular staff at the houses. The members of Unity Housing run everything. Unity Housing saves a significant amount of money there. Unity Housing is basically a democratic association. Everything is voted on. We don't do things against people's will.
In licensed facilities, a bed comes open in the facility, and very shortly afterwards, the Ministry of Health and the licensed facility just say, okay, here's your new roommate. Boom, live with them. Where in Unity Housing, the person first gets interviewed by John, and the house then gets a chance to meet with the person, talk to the person, and then they get voted in by the House members, and the House members have the option of saying no.
Okay, when I do intake, I really make it clear, if you get ill, we are not going to evict you. We are going to hang in with you and make sure that you still have your home. We try to get a mix of people, maybe one really ill person in the house, and then the rest of the people in the house to support that person.
Community housing gives people safe, secure housing. Because the thing is, when you have your basic needs covered, you can then deal with the more important things.
Sorry, we didn't get all of that. Yes. Okay. So that's the video that Alex created with Alex, the film student out here. And we were really happy to have that as part of the project. So the historical module for the models of practice was given to us by the Parkdale Activity and Recreation Centre, or PARC, as it's known in Toronto. And PARC is one of our partners, our community partners on the After the Asylum project, and it's in fact a partner on the teaching project as well. PARC was founded in 1980. It was a sanctuary and a haven for patients who were being released from the Queen Street Mental, as what is now KMH, and the other institutions that were closing their doors at that time in Toronto. And these people were not being welcomed elsewhere in Toronto's Parkdale neighborhood. So community people got together and founded PARC, and 40 years on, PARC remains a very important space of hope for many people. But what we find also inspiring about PARC is that it has become recognized in the Parkdale community as a vital civic institution in itself. So it's not just a space for stigmatized individuals, it's a place where you can go. They've got a tool library, and you can go if you need to go, borrow some tools to do some work in your house. And so they're part of the fabric today that makes Parkdale a unique Toronto community. So the teaching unit that has been put together with PARC support will include stuff about creativity at PARC. It includes a cluster of ideas around PARC as a living room for people who don't have living rooms and the meaning of that, and using historical sources to talk about that. And it also has a section on the story of Edmund Yu. And for those of you who have some connection with PARC or with Toronto, you might remember that Edmund Yu was a young man with schizophrenia who lived with schizophrenia and the other aspects, soul-destroying aspects of severe mental health. For 10 years in 1997, Edmund Yu was involved in an altercation on a city bus and was shot and killed by police officers. So this, at that point, it had a huge media impact, but it also had a huge impact on PARC because Edmund had been part of the PARC community. He was a member of PARC. And Bob Rose, an outreach worker at PARC, had established a relationship with Edmund. And Edmund was, slowly opening up to Bob, and, they'd met in 1996, and he was opening up to Bob, and Bob was trying to help him. Anyway, so our researcher on the project went out and interviewed Bob about Edmund.
Very unusual thinker, talker. I mean, his mind was very quick, and it was moving pretty quick too. And so he would, say these things that were very, thought-provoking. If they weren't thought-provoking, I would never remember them. Then, of course, they would never have been stated, and they would never have gotten written down, or they wouldn't have ended up in the media, or they wouldn't have ended up in the documentary, or they wouldn't have ended up in all of these different ways that we use to tell the story of it. If they hadn't been significant, they wouldn't have made a resonance with the public. So, what Edmund says, reality is sometimes painful. And I remember when he said it, because it was the night we failed to find the St. Joe's Cole make it work. And we came back, and it was snowing, and I stood in the doorway of the park entrance with him, out of the snow coming down, and I was upset. More upset than he, that he couldn't stay there. Because, of course, I'm going to worry. And I'm getting ready to say goodnight to him and go home and leave him on the street. So he's the one that said to me, reality can sometimes be painful. Well, put his hand on my shoulder, kind of reassured me. And then he said, there is no place in the world for me. And, somebody says something like that, those two things together in one, that's, you're never going to forget that. Certainly never going to forget it if they get shot about a week later. So, and I consider, of course, that was exactly what my job was. However it was I was going to get it done, was I was going to find a place. He and I were going to find that there was a place in the world for him. Find some way to that place. It's not something I could make for him. I can't deliver that for him. And it may be that he couldn't get it on his own either. But maybe together we would find something, or at least a direction suggested that he was wrong. There was a place in the world for him, and we're going to try some. After we get tired of doing the same, like the old things, going over the old patterns, right, which were negative and suffering and alienation and exclusion and like loss and grief and having no place, just wondering and having no place. I think it's sort of done with that. And then you start to kind of break the mold, and maybe something new is going to come. Something new is going to emerge. That's what I really believe is going to happen with Edmund. Not the shooting.
So, the people at the park members, members and staff, saw the tragedy of Edmund Yu as in a much broader context than just that moment, and you can hear that in Bob's statement. They saw it as stemming from problems far larger than Edmund's personal struggles. And Park's very establishment was a response to a system that left mental health patients without viable material and social options. So I'm now going to play another piece from the teaching resource, which is Victor Willis, the executive director at Park, talking about deinstitutionalization and Park.
Right around the time that deinstitutionalization was happening, we had a bunch of these homes that were left almost vacant. And because people who were leaving them, they were moving to the suburbs. Even those buildings on Jameson, etc., which were set up to be kind of like the new modernism, were only part of the answer. And they were built in the 50s, and even they were starting to lose their luster. So everybody was moving to the suburbs, and so there was a high vacancy rate, and houses were very cheap to buy. And so enterprising people bought them, put a bunch of locks in all the doors, and rented them out. No standards, right? But that's what was happening. At the very time that deinstitutionalization was going on, people said, oh, well, I can become a boarding home operator. And so people set up little homes for special care or whatever. People were living 5 to a room. So, Pat Capone, who, of course, worked here, her first real book was Upstairs in the Crazy House, and she talks about a boarding home that she lived in, Shannon Court. And, the conditions were pretty deplorable. That was the standard. So Park began as a response to, you've got all these adults living in rooming houses and boarding homes. If you're living 5 to a room, you're probably not going to stay in your room. So you're going to end up then being on the streets. So volunteers and people said, well, they've got to do something. So they proposed Park. And Park opened a few years later as a response, a place for people to go. That was the Living Room to Thousands piece, because people didn't have a place to go. As soon as people came to Park, they started to talk about where they lived. And as soon as they started to talk about where they lived, we were going, holy shit, that sounds terrible. And so you can imagine that, that workers would immediately start to say, well, we got to do something about that. And so, and Bob started, he can give you some pretty good historical context, because he worked at Archway, but he did a lot of his work in the boarding homes, and he saw all of these sort of terrible places. So, Park members' experience and Park's kind of role was really to reflect and comment on what members would tell us about their lives. So you have these sort of overlaying issues because housing is a foundational piece of your life. If you don't have a place to live, whether it's home or not, So the first thing you need, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you get I need shelter, I need food, and of course we're constantly with the fact that people, if you're very poor, you can afford one of the two, but often you can't afford both. So you can afford shelter.
Okay. So I don't have time to play all the pictures because I'm watching the time, but basically that part of the Park teaching site will knit together the story of Edmund Yu and the creation and the engagement of Park in housing and the politics of housing in Parkdale, using history as a teaching tool to explore housing. So I wanted to just finish off and take some time to share a few of the reflections from the group, from our community experts in the teaching group. And here's Dana and Alistair, whose reflections demonstrate a very powerful wish amongst people who use mental health services to make them better. And Alex Vercade, another member of the group, talked about something that was really important to him, which is about having consumer survivors contribute to bettering their own situation. It was something he believed in really strongly. And even Lisa Marie's comment speaks to that wish to be involved in the process of improving mental health services. Though it also speaks to the need of projects like the one I've been involved in to appreciate the material circumstances of community partners. People talked about how good the food was at our meetings as well. And one thing that came out of the participant reflections was the importance of projects like this as providing some sort of social base for people. And a number of people who were involved in the project said they wish they could have spent more time, it had been more collaborative, they would have got to know people a bit better. And I think this observation is really very important. There were a couple of moments that were just golden in the project. I mean, one of them, Alex, had made that video, and I thought it was really good, the one about Unity Housing, but I could sense that he was reserved about it, like that there was some issue. And so I just sort of said, Alex, is there something that you were disappointed with about the video? And he said, well, I just hate seeing myself on film, because I'm so overweight and my hair's a mess. And the guy sitting next to him happened to be a project group member called Lanny Beckman, was Alex's hero, right? He never met him, but he was the founder of MPA. And Lanny just leaned over and just rubbed Alex's back of his neck. And I just thought, oh, that was just, I couldn't have made Alex feel as good as he did in that moment, right? There was also a very interesting conversation about sex that came suddenly in a meeting that I don't have time to talk about right now. Maybe in the question period. So I just wanted to finish with this exchange from Kat and Branwen's reflections just about the need to tell the story and how projects like this at the end of the day, by giving people space, by sharing authority, we get to hear really important stories. And the map that we used to create the teaching resources was a story in itself, as were all the meetings and every single one of the community experts' contributions, from Laurie's puppet show to Dana and Alistair's sculpture to, Alex's video, were stories. And we brought our stories, our historical stories, to the project as well. So that finishes up my presentation, and thank you so much for coming here today to listen to me talk about this.
Any thoughts or comments from, Helen, please.
I have to say I'm a little bit tentative about making a comment, partly because I'm so old and I remember so much of the history of mental health and the hospitals for psychiatric patients and defectives in the beginning in British Columbia. I can remember a lot of that. And I was blown away by your presentation. Now, you see, I've not been in the literature recently for any of this kind of background, but to me it's earth-shattering that you have the insight to use the voices of the people themselves to provide the background of what we need, what we would like, help us with this, and so on. To my knowledge now, okay, the rest can comment. I see that as a revolution, an evolution of where practitioners can go in their planning of services. And that's why I'm so impressed by this. I thought, what a brilliant idea to actually hear from those who experience the illness what they would like in the way of a service. So thank you, Megan, for that insight. It's wonderful for me to hear.
They've been a wonderful group to work with. It's been a very cool project because and for me as a historian, it's fairly recent in my own work that I've actually talked to real people, right? Historians usually, we deal with the past, and many of the people that we like to talk to are no longer here. So it really...
Do you want to comment, Megan? Because I think that would be, a contribution for all of us to understand how you came to this sort of model. Because it didn't sort of drop out of the air. I think it was in some ways driven by the initiative and the involvement of the people who you make sort of part of the project. In some ways. So it was sort of a back and forth process between involving people and then thinking about, so maybe how
yes,
it
I
came
think
to be.
So there's a number of things that happened in my work life. And with the other two teaching resources, the first one for the secondary students, the website called Caring Minds, and I worked with a colleague at the University of Victoria. I had never done public consultations, and so she took the lead in that, and we went out and met with a group in Toronto of people who use mental health services, but we never took it back to them, and that bothered me. So I sort of filed that away. That I wanted to, I didn't think that was right. Like, they should have had a chance to give us feedback about what we did with their ideas. And the other thing that, along with Gertie, we did these oral history interviews with early members of Vancouver's MPA, or what it was called then, the Mental Patients Association, and eventually made this documentary with them that I'm going to have the pleasure of showing here. So that was a collaborative project, and to me, suddenly, I could see that you could work with people to create something that was incredibly powerful, that had a much stronger resonance than a dry academic article, right? So it's not that I don't want to write those academic articles, but it really changed the way in which I understood the usefulness of history. I wanted to make history useful, and I wanted to empower historical actors, especially ones who've been so marginalized. So it is one of the teaching resources, the piece that Lanny Beckman contributed, which he just sort of wrote in 20 minutes. Really powerful 2-page, maybe 3-page memoir about being a student, a psychology student, 4th-year psychology student at UBC, probably 1962, I'm guessing, and going on a field trip out to Riverview, as it was, mental hospital then, and looking at these patients. 2 years later, he was himself incarcerated, if you want to use that term, in the Buffalo County Mental Hospital. And he writes about those 2 pieces of his life and how he suddenly, at that moment, came to understand that the world was divided into us and them. That's what he calls the piece, I think. And so this is a really powerful piece by a member of our group. That was his artistic contribution. So in that piece there is history and there is current commentary. Very powerful.
Yeah, and Jason, I will invite you in a minute.
I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I had a comment there too, because I'm wondering, even hear people's thought, because in some ways what the process enabled was to include the subject of history, so to speak, as people who contribute insights and have a perspective on their own history as well. And so in thinking about that model for education, what I think, I agree, you brilliantly tried to do and to role model here also, Megan, is might give us thoughts as to how we can also use that model in our teaching in terms of, you might not have the time as long as a project, but even in a term setting or in a class setting even, how this might give thoughts about how to include students in the creation of reflecting on the teaching and become experts in the teaching process in ways that we haven't even considered necessarily as to how it could be cross-fertilization.
Well, that's a really good idea.
Yeah, it came more to me when I was speaking, because I had so many moments here that I thought, if I had it in class, I would stop it here and I would ask the students. And I think that's kind of what this material invites, because even the starting project where you showed Laurie's artwork, that has not necessarily a whole, written piece on it, but to show it and then have responses.
And Laurie is very interesting, because I read her reflections and on creating that piece, which I didn't realize because I wasn't involved with that part of the project, that she decided against having an audio because she wanted to make the puppet show just more open to interpretation. She didn't want to be, she wanted to leave it open, which I thought was really
But anyway, I would be interested if we asked the student, how do you want to be taught in the process, that could open up a whole new education process that we haven't necessarily, that I not necessarily always considered, but could build on in some ways. But Jason, I interrupted you.
No, thank you. That's true. So I'm a big proponent of the usable past. I'm a historian teaching at a professional school, and so one has to make the past sort of usable for one's students in a number of different ways. And this is an outstanding example of how one can do that. The incredibly rich materials that we've collected are certainly enormously valuable. But when I teach the usable past, I always often worry about the abusable past. I have these gnawing doubts that sort of eat around the edges of the project like this, and they're about things like presentism, Whiggish interpretations of history, the trials of oral history and memory, and sort of the sins that people commit against history unknowingly, and that historians just go ballistic about. And already sitting in this room, I mean, I can hear that gnawing going on. The idea that we're responding to the look how far we've come from from the bad old days, or the idea that, I was there and I remember. How do you sort of account for those problems that are inherent in this exercise?
I think I think those are real concerns. I think the voices of our community experts do address any sense of complacency about where we are right now in mental health. Absolutely, because they're deeply unhappy with the offerings that are out there right now. But I guess that the thing is that having multiple voices and multiple perspectives helps destabilize history as a category that can be nailed down, right? And that's good. And I think it's tricky because, in a sense, we went into our After the Asylum pieces. We looked for stuff that was a slice, right? A teachable slice. And what we heard from, particularly at Douglas College, was that instructors have almost no time to slide this material in, right? They've got to push people through their programs really quickly. So, we're just doing the best we can with that. And it's going to be a bit of a soundbite, but better than nothing at all, I think. But it is, and they asked us for happy stories. Could we give them happy stories? So I think a happy story can be quite sneaky. So I presented my sneaky idea, right? That, Laurie's piece looks pretty, but it's actually it's an unsettling puppet show too, right? So I think those are really important cautionary notes, and I don't know that you can ever really, or you would never want to have that voice going, is this okay? You never want to have that silence because I think we have to be thinking critically all the time about what we're presenting. But I think it's a challenge of this kind of site, because really that historians like to really contextualize, and that was with the film, right? A documentary film isn't about facts, it's about emotion. And I had to learn that as a producer, that we wouldn't be explaining things, we'd just be creating this film, and that I was going to take the back seat to the people in the film, that it was their interpretation of history, So, yeah, it's not going to be perfect and I think that it's important what you're saying. Those are very important comments. Yeah. I'm not sure if I answered them, if I gave you a really good answer, but...
I have a comment as well also that I don't know if it should stir further discussion, but I would like your perspective on that one too, Megan, because if you say I'm a historian in the professional domain, I can say the opposite way around in some ways. I'm a professional, and with this project I stepped in sort of the history domain on a team,
yes.
Because it was a history project, and I do history for my research, so it was not that I am not also in history, but in this project I have had multiple moments, and we talked about it, that I felt like a professional visitor in a history project, and that I realized that my challenge is in some ways that I want to not predetermine how a professional is portrayed in the project. Because there is strong history, particularly in mental health, that polarizes patient activism, a lot of academic support through the anti-psychiatry era, but to sort of avoid being sort of framed already in a predetermined way as a professional. As if a professional in some ways can only be and live up to be what the professional was framed to be through the anti-psychiatric critique. And I felt that as something that I had to hold on to in discussions and sort of still, because, and that's why I'm so pleased that Megan agreed to come, not necessarily do a big presentation like we do here now on the whole project, but on this particular documentary to the school at large, but purposefully come to the classroom where the psychiatric practice is going to be taught, and have the nurses who are going to be nurses come and say, what is this material meaning to look at as a resource to reflect on who we want to be as professionals. So I think and so I think there is a lot to use this material, not necessarily only bring history to the professions, but bring professions to history as well, and see how that can generate debate. I don't know.
And I think history is really important, and particularly because I think what it teaches people is that everybody's history is different and unique. So you can get everybody talking about, say, the World War I. Depending on who you get, their interpretation is going to be different, their experience is going to be different. And I think it's the same with mental health. And I think it's great because you've got a good variety of people, differences, but always in history, everybody's history is unique. And I think for nursing, for whatever profession, you're always looking at that, who you're working with, and their history. It's really important in working with, I think, anybody, is around their own personal history. Because it's going to be different than anybody else. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really important. And I think what this does, it gets people to look at different perspectives and to, it makes it richer. It makes it richer in terms of your ideas and how you approach things. I think the more histories you get, but you'll still get different histories if you went somewhere else to ask people about what they're doing.
Yes, and to our mind, that that understanding of complexity is something that our community experts said is lacking in current mental health practice. That they are just seen as a person with this particular diagnosis, and they say, no, I'm, an artist, and I'm this kind of, I'm all these other things, and I want to be seen as a complex individual. So complexities in history, I think that's our hope, that putting that perspective forward will allow it to translate into other aspects of practice. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's a good note to end. Yeah, thank you all so much.